Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. And today I have a very special guest. I am with Dale Buckner. He is the CEO and founder of Global Guardian, a private security team that helps basically rescue people from war zones. And so I definitely wanted to get his perspective. And so Dale, thank you for joining me today.
Great to see you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, first things first, let's talk about just your assets on the ground. Is everybody safe? Is everybody okay, just given the situation?
Yeah, so we have two teams in Ukraine, a team in Slovakia, a team in Hungary, two teams in Poland, and a team in Romania. Obviously, the two teams in Ukraine are the most exposed. We are driving 50 passenger buses, 20 passenger buses, 9 passenger sprinter vans on a daily basis. We're moving anywhere between 250 to 500 people a day. And just this morning, as you can imagine, we were moving from the western side of the country near the Polish border towards Kyiv, the capital. And we had rockets go over our vehicles. We've had vehicles and buses come within a shouting distance of Russian troops in some cases, and columns north of Kyiv. So this is dynamic. It's war. There's nothing worse than war. There's nothing harder than war. Most importantly, there's nothing more uncertain than war. And we're experiencing that every day. We have had missions where we were going in and we simply had to turn around because there were firefights and so on and so forth. So we're literally operating in a war zone, which is just loaded with uncertainty and danger.
Right. Absolutely. And I, from what I understand and from what I've read of Global Guardian, you basically have select clientele, meaning you are, I let's say as a high profile executive could pay you to extricate me or exfiltrate me from a war zone and all of that. But it seems like Global Guardian is doing a lot more if you are taking hundreds of people, to the borders in Ukraine, which obviously is a fantastic thing. So are you going above and beyond your normal operational scope of just your clients, or
Yeah.
what decisions have you made as Global Guardian in that vein?
Yeah, so nothing new here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of historic framework. We evacuated almost 200 people out of the Paris attacks in 2015, literally 6 attack sites, rounds going off. That was really the kickoff of being in the emergency response business for us, followed by the Turkey coup, which of course we had to get and evacuate clients out of a very uncertain environment, tanks on the streets again. And then if you saw the 2 back-to-back hurricanes that hit the Caribbean in 2017, first in the Virgin Islands, then Puerto Rico, we evacuated a little over 1,800 people out of that disaster zone. Fast forward to Afghanistan, we just evacuated almost 600 people out of Afghanistan just a few months ago. And during the Myanmar coup last year, we got about 400 clients out. So wow. We are in this space. It is part of our business model. And to be very direct, it is our #1 differential in the space. Unlike our competitors or insurance, we do not deploy people after the fact. We don't deploy expats, meaning Americans typically, or British ex-military or Secret Service types. We utilize teams in country. And what that does is it allows, one, they're there, they speak the language, they can legally carry weapons, which expats cannot. So I could have a whole team of Delta Force or SEAL Team 6 from America, but they can't carry weapons, which means they're kind of useless. And they typically don't speak the language. So for all those reasons, we have teams in 134 countries. In this case, we had 2 standing teams in Ukraine, which means the tagline we use is we move in minutes and hours. I don't have to deploy people. I don't need infrastructure. I don't need assets. They're there right now, 24/7. And that model has really differentiated us from everybody else that can take weeks to months to actually get to their clients. So it's been really, really important to us in this model. Right. And now we're in Ukraine. So I think this is going to go on for months. I don't see it any different than Afghanistan. We were evacuating people in Afghanistan for over 3.5 months. I fully intend, this is not going away in days and weeks. This will go for months, depending on what the Russians do. With the only note being, if we find a diplomatic solution, which is highly unlikely, but if we do, that's when this will come down. But even if there's a diplomatic solution, now you have to reverse engineer all of this, Nick. So we're going to have lots of corporate clients that want to go from Poland, Romania, Hungary, back into their home office. And they're going to need help because now we have to move 1 million people back into country. So it's just fraught with, once these wars start, again, they're just uncertain, they're violent, and you never know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Right, right. And in that vein, as I've just been talking, and interviewing others regarding the situation as well, is all news in a war zone is retroactive. We are always behind what, the Fox News, the CNNs, the MSNBCs of the world, the BBCs are telling us. And so by virtue of that, what kind of communication right now do you have with your personnel? What's the latest news from them, as we are sitting here Wednesday at, around 11 a.m. Central Time here?
Yeah. So interesting. It's a great question from you. You're the cyber expert here. I know you're tracking the cyber attacks that Russia has been executing within Ukraine. We're seeing that same traffic. We know it's real. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, the grid has not gone down. Phone lines work, cell phone towers are up, computers and the internet are working. Mm-hmm. And now, has there been intermittent disruption? Sure. But for the general populace, we're communicating on our tracking app, our apps, cell phones, WhatsApp, all those standard things you would communicate with during peacetime, to be frank, with very little disruption. And again, not from a pure cyber perspective, from a very militaristic perspective. The Russians really have two weaknesses in their army. Number one is command and control. Yes, they have a massive amount of tanks, massive amount of ships, massive amount of helicopters and aircraft. It's great to have all those assets, but if you cannot synchronize them, in the US military, they call it combined arms synchronization, meaning they cannot get the synchronization of the ground force to the air, to the naval, and make it and maximize that capacity. They're all stovepiped. It's their number one difference. We are attributing to the fact that because they have such a difficult time communicating, that they haven't shut the grid down because they're using it. We know that for a fact in open source, that the Russians are using the open net, the open web, the cell phone towers, just like we are, because their weakness is command and control and communication. Two, the second weakness, and you see it in the open source, to your point, we're all watching this 40-mile plus convoy north of Kyiv, right? Ready to go in if and when they take the city. Ultimately, their secondary weakness is they have absolutely no capability to manage their supply chain. Meaning if 25 men in a 100-man company are injured or killed or sick, they have a very difficult time replacing them. If a tank or vehicle is destroyed, they have a very difficult time replacing that vehicle. Their supply chain, just basic food, water, medical, is not very good. So when you think about their inability to synchronize their assets and then supply them, we believe the reason they haven't shut the grid down, we're using the same grid they are, is because of that weakness. So up until now, we're going into our 7th day here in combat operations. And to your point, we're always a day behind. Our intel, we're getting it from our teams and then pushing it out. We just pushed another one about 2 hours ago. It's always about a day behind. But that's my very direct answer on why you're seeing the Russians haven't taken the grid down, because they clearly have the capability, at least at a much more disruptive level. It just it has not happened because we think they need it as much as everyone else, frankly.
Right. And that parrots, I think, some of what Ina Sovson, that's the member of parliament I interviewed on early Monday morning here, was basically saying is that, outside of the actual direct zones that are taking hits and, firefights are going on, the internet for the most part seems to be stable. Also that, Ukraine is roughly the size of Texas with the population of California. And so there are huge swaths of Ukraine that are simply peaceful right now. Having 150,000 troops may seem like a lot, but an occupying force for that many
drop in
people,
the bucket.
Yeah, it's just not enough. So in that vein, I'm obviously glad you're able to successfully communicate and that the infrastructure is stable enough, through the cyber attacks, through the bombings, through everything else for you guys to talk. But I want to switch real quick, just out of curiosity, because recently President Zelensky was offered an evacuation by NATO for him and his family, because he said he's target number 1 and target number 2. And he famously said, well, he didn't need a ride, he needs ammunition. Now, if he, for whatever reason, changes his mind, and it doesn't seem like he's going to, he's dug in, would at this point NATO be able to extract him now that there's just basically heavy fighting in Kyiv? The Russians are relentlessly bombing it with a hard push to invade. We're also now seeing Kharkiv essentially paratroopers have landed. Would NATO have the ability to exfiltrate Zelensky, his family, top Ukrainian officials at this point, or is that ship sailed?
It's a two-part answer.
Okay.
The official versus the unofficial. The official answer is this: the stance of NATO and the United States is they will not set one foot within Ukraine because of the fear that they will start World War III. If NATO forces or US forces were to get into a firefight with Russians, that is the impetus to World War III, which no one wants, obviously.
Right.
So for that reason, officially, yes, we will reinforce the Polish border, the Romanian border, Hungary, so on and so forth. No question. That being said, the unofficial answer is, could organizations like NATO have a fixer and contract firms like us? We've done lots of work for nondescript governments where they need a non-official or a non-state government actor that legally can operate, which we can because we are leveraging Ukrainian citizens that are licensed in that country to carry weapons and operate and do security missions. Could they utilize a firm like us to execute an evacuation of him and his family? The answer is absolutely yes. And we've done this in Venezuela. We've done it in Colombia. We've done it in a few places in Africa. It's completely legal. It just simply needs to be done in a very sensitive fashion, if you will. But to answer your question directly, no, NATO nor the US is ever going to go in and get him directly because they cannot take that risk.
Gotcha. And that kind of dovetailed with my next question about, NATO using a global guardian or private security forces essentially as a de facto wing, of that, meaning you guys can go in, you can get top Ukrainian officials for them on their behalf, and then no NATO ally has to have boots on the ground in order to extract him. So with that, I'm also curious to know, outside of Ukraine at this moment, if you can talk about it, is Global Guardian involved in any conflicts, or are all your resources basically focused on Ukraine right now, just given the horrific situation? If you can talk about
it. So again, this goes back to the model. We have teams in 134 countries. Mm-hmm. Just because there's a war going on in Ukraine, that does not mean we're going to execute 125 to 150 missions next month around the world. We're not utilizing one set or one team of security agents from any one part of the world. So yes, we're surging in Ukraine, clearly, but that does not affect the team in Japan, the team in Saudi Arabia, the team in Bogota, Colombia, the team in Argentina, so on and so forth. They're uninhibited. They have full capacity. They're not involved. We don't want them involved. We want people that speak the language, understand the terrain, have connections to the government, are licensed to carry weapons. So because the model is dispersed, yes, are we surging? Part of my ops center is doing nothing but Ukraine operations. The other half, routine is routine. It cannot be disrupted because I have Fortune 1000 clients that even though there's a war going on in Europe, that doesn't mean they don't need to get to Asia. It doesn't mean they don't need to get to the Middle East. It doesn't mean they don't need support in Central South America tomorrow. And those missions cannot be disrupted just because we're dealing with a war zone in Ukraine. So as you look at this, and I use this term all the time, and I've said it, the routine has to be routine. That can never be disrupted. And then when we have a hurricane, a coup, the tornadoes through the central part of the country, and or you have a war zone, you can't just stop and call a timeout with the rest of the business and what you owe your client base. Right. So this is the art and science. It's a bit of a dance, but frankly, if you simply took a line and block chart and said, we're simply going to separate the two, crisis action, emergency response is working in Ukraine, the rest of the world goes on in day-to-day fashion without disruption.
Okay. Now, also, just from a hypothetical, assume for a moment that I was a client of Global Guardians. I found myself caught, God forbid, in a war zone. Basically, how would I, as one of your clients, be in communication with you under this emergency? How long would an extraction take? What does that look like if I was caught in a war zone?
Yep. Well, I'll tell you exactly what we're doing today for all of our clients equally. It's a uniform model. We're going to send you a spreadsheet with the key data we need. And here's the key data. One is the city and address. This has to be precise. We're either going to come to you in an exact location at an exact time, or if we have multiple clients in a small city, we're going to bring them to a consolidation point, like a church that everybody knows. And we're going to be very precise about where to be, when. So it's a time and location. We're going to load, manifest. There'll be people that fall off. There'll be people that get added. This is chaos. It's war. Once we have that, we send it to the client headquarters, typically in Europe or the US, validate the manifest, tell them who didn't show up, tell them who did and who got added, get approval for launch, and then we move. From that point, Nick, it completely depends on the conditions. Some days we've gotten to the Polish border in 4.5 hours, drop the client, they get across in 8 hours, 12 to 14 hours max. We've had other clients 50 kilometers from the border. It is dead stop traffic. It took 20 hours to go 8 kilometers. They literally walked the last 5 to 7 miles and then stood in line for almost another 18 hours to get across that border. It is all conditions based. It is very difficult to predict. It is cold. You have to have good walking shoes and standing shoes. You have to have snacks. You have to have water. You have to be prepared. And this is the guidance we give every client. You have to be prepared to be outside in the elements for 24 plus hours. If you think in those terms and you have a baby, you need diapers, you need formula, all those things with the mindset that you're going to be exposed in the elements, crossing a border and out for at least 24 hours. Now, sometimes it's shorter, sometimes it's a little longer, but that is the uncertainty and the fog of war that we're dealing with. Mm-hmm. And what you're going to find is, not to be critical, but if you have an HR director or a chief security officer who's never been to combat, who's been a federal law enforcement guy, or sat somewhere in a non-combat role, this is hard for them to grasp because it's not intuitive. And Nick, I'm assuming you've never been to combat. Why would we expect you to understand how truly chaotic it is? You can see it on TV, you can read about it. Till you've experienced it, it's really tough to fully comprehend. So bottom line is we do our best to prep them to think about things that can happen and make them understand that literally, yes, it's a 4.5 hour trip. It might take you 36 hours. And just frame that on how uncertain and how violent and how anything can happen in a combat zone. It's unlike anything else in this world we live in. There's nothing else like it. And I don't mean in a good way. So.
Right. And I actually, just on an aside, got into a debate with somebody that said, well, I'd be perfectly fine. I play Call of Duty. And I'm like, no, like you have no idea, this is not an Xbox simulation. This is just pure savagery and chaos. Like you can't prepare for that unless you've, like I said, been prepared through it, in terms of military experience. And in that vein, I read your bio and I know that, you're a retired US Army colonel. You've got decades of intelligence, counterterrorism, and special operations experience. And so I wanted to ask you, what is your honest take on the Russian invasion right now? How's it going for both the Russians and the Ukrainians? What do you think Ukraine's going to look like sooner than later? You mentioned a little earlier here that this is going to be going on for months and months and months. I read a report that essentially members of Congress were told expect 10 to 20 years of possible insurgencies and all of that. But I'd like to get your take on essentially what you think is happening. How are the Russians doing? How are the Ukrainians doing? Just an unbiased, review.
Yep. So I'll answer this in 3 parts.
Sure.
Right now, in the immediate, from the Russian perspective, I think Russia assumed, and what happens when people assume, that this would go very similar to 2014 under the Obama administration, where they basically took Crimea without a shot fired. And the reality is, since 2014, Ukraine is not the same Ukraine today as it was in 2014. We got embarrassed. NATO got embarrassed in 2014. And since we brought in lethal aid en masse, we brought in US special and NATO special forces to train the Ukrainians. And the population has found nationalism. They have bought into being a democratic, potentially NATO member in the future. Right. I think they see the pitfalls of going down the communist route. And I think you've got a populace that is better armed, better trained, and has a sense of purpose and nationalism. That's a dangerous combination. So I think the Russians have miscalculated. I know a lot of people are saying this, and I agree with it. On the Ukrainian side, I think they've put up wonderful resistance. They've taken down close to 80 plus aircraft. That's the last stat I saw, with Stinger missiles and other anti-aircraft weaponry that the Russians have not been able to take out.
I think the technological advantage they have and the sheer will to survive is much greater than the will and the morale of the Russian military. So in the immediate, I think the Ukrainians done much better than anticipated. They have pushed back, and it's wonderful to see. Here's the downside to that story. The Russians have enough equipment, enough men, and enough training that if they want to push this, they will eventually win. If they want to take losses, they will take great losses. They will lose a lot of equipment and men, but they have such sheer mass. Frankly, it's a war of attrition. And if they want it, they will win, period. End of story. That you can't stop that. That being said, I think the world is watching. Putin is getting a lot of pressure internal, even with the most powerful oligarchs, and people are not questioning these tactical decisions. And I think, you know, there's clearly some friction inside his administration. Ultimately, the last point here, at least in the short term, is this. Putin can't lose. He's going to throw the kitchen sink at this. If tactically he is repelled and gets enough pressure that he has to pull back, I think he'll pull everybody out, and the potential of him dropping a tactical nuke on Kiev just to tell the world how powerful they are and that he can claim he won, it's not out of the realm of feasible or possible, which is the scariest scenario of all.
That is terrifying.
Lastly, do I think there is still an opportunity for a diplomatic solution where everybody can win and de-escalate? I do. I think that if we could tell Putin, you now own the Donbass area and you've expanded, it's yours. You now own Crimea, you've expanded from the south up into the west, it's yours. And we can give him some kind of out so he doesn't feel like a caged animal. I think you could find some level of stalemate. We can announce and make it look like he won something and find our way out of this with one caveat. Let's assume we did that. Let's assume we came to some kind of diplomatic solution to stalemate. They get something and they retreat the military other than occupying and expanding Crimea and the Donbass. Here's the caution. This isn't going away. If you're Vladimir Putin or Russia, you're not going to ever let this go. Ukraine technically is not a NATO country. They cannot allow it to be a NATO country, because if they do, they will have literally lost 20 countries to NATO since its expansion. And this is the red line. This is the red line for Russia. He has nowhere else to go. There's no other country left on his border that hasn't turned. And to put this into perspective, from an American perspective, if the Russians were on the Canadian border and the Russians were on the Mexico border, how secure would we feel every night? How secure would New York City feel up near where we have Russian artillery and missiles coming off the East Coast, off the ocean? How secure would we feel? The answer is we wouldn't. So if you reverse engineer this purely from a Russian standpoint, and understand, one, he feels encroached on and he's got weapons sitting on his border. We're right there. That's unnerving. And then two, if your whole goal and purpose in life, as Putin's life is to bring back Russia to the number one and number two superpowers in the world, being the US and Russia, that's his dream, that's his goal. He's getting older, and this is not going well. Russia's a gas station acting as a nation state.
Right.
He's losing momentum. He has to control that population, and this is the only way he can control that population. So we're in a very difficult position. And I think ultimately there is a tactical situation, there is a short term, and there is a long term, and no one knows what's going to happen next. We can only look at history and trends and make some assumptions and then see what happens.
Right. Now, with that, do you think, I mean, and obviously, as you say, if Russia's basically attaining critical mass within Ukraine right now to essentially take Kyiv and, God forbid, a tactical nuclear strike against anywhere in the world. But if they are able to conquer this, as I mentioned, they don't have enough for an occupying army. So I got the impression when I was speaking with that member of parliament that they were going to fight essentially to the last man. If it's insurgency and guerrilla warfare and all of that, I mean, how do you think a armed population would fare against essentially Russian occupation in that zone?
So Nick, I most recently, if you can find this open source on my bio,
I served in Afghanistan. I served in Iraq. I did multiple tours throughout the Middle East. I've also served in Central South America, notably Colombia, which when I was a young captain in Special Forces, that was my first taste of something real. It wasn't training. I was in the middle of an insurgency with the FARC in Colombia.
Right.
So here's my answer. How do you think, and I'm a former officer in the military, how do you think the United States did in Baghdad, in Iraq, and Kabul, and Afghanistan? Do you think we won? Because my personal opinion is we lost both those wars. We lost in Vietnam, and the FARC is now reconstituting itself in Colombia. Mm-hmm. Here's the bottom line. Insurgencies are hard. Insurgencies are expensive. And insurgencies are costly in men and equipment, and they're draining. It's hard to win. And I think we just went through the longest conflict in the history of the United States between Iraq and Afghanistan. I think our exit proves this is incredibly difficult to quote unquote win. Did we win tactically day in and day out? Yes. Did we win the hearts and minds and convert the government, create a democracy? Not even close. Iraq is nowhere near a democracy. Afghanistan is not a democracy at the end of the day, by all intents and purposes. These are not real. And we didn't win, and we didn't do well. And these will be black marks on us forever. And I think the lesson over and over and over is that when you go in as an occupying force into a country that does not share your values, does not share your language, does not share your culture, your probability of quote unquote winning is almost zero. It's incredibly difficult. So do I think that Russia with 190,000 troops can occupy, to your point, the entire country? Not a chance. We couldn't do it in Iraq. We being NATO and the US, and most people forget Afghanistan was a NATO run mission. It was not a US mission.
Right.
We couldn't control Afghanistan, which is a relatively small country. We being the US and NATO. We, the US, could not control all of Iraq. Not even close. So why would we ever think a poorly trained, man and equipped army of Russia could do it? My answer is they can't, they won't, and they will lose in the end. And the question is, how long until they capitulate, just like they did in Afghanistan? How long until they realize they can control city populations? They can control the eastern border in Donbass. They control Crimea. Mm-hmm. They won't control anything else. Not in the long term. Not for the next, X number of years. It's an impossible task. So their probability of winning in that environment is they can win in pockets. They cannot win the entire country.
Gotcha. And that actually dovetails with, I think, probably the last question I've got for you. And thank you for your time today. But we are seeing also reports that are saying that Russian troops are actually being moved from Eastern Russia into Western Russia, obviously, where the fighting is happening and all of that. Is that an indicator to you that Russia is struggling with trained military manpower or resources, obviously due to this war?
I'm not sure if it's indication of training as sure as I think they've come to the realization, as the world has, that I think they miscalculated. I think they thought, little under 200,000 troops with their air superiority, naval superiority, they were going to roll in. And frankly, there would be enough Russian sympathizers that this would not be overly difficult. I think the realization is they now realize 200,000 troops, not going to get it. So now in the short term, again, in order to save face, in order to at least take over city populations and take over the capital to change out the government, their calculus now is, we're going to have to bring in another 100,000, 150,000 troops just to get reinforcement of the capital and the Donbass area and Crimea, just to hold those three center populations is the calculus.
Wow. Well, and that's I think actually really good insight. It's, war is never a pretty thing, no matter how it ends. And I'm glad that the Ukrainians are holding their own at the moment and fighting this. And I'm glad they're being supplied now by Germany and the United States with, the desperately needed anti-tank weapons and everything else. And Dale, thank you so much for your time. And if anybody wants to learn about you or Global Guardian, how can they find you? Where should they go?
Yeah, literally, it's a Google search or whatever platform. You just put in Global Guardian. It's all out there. It's all open source. Everything from the management team to the advisory board to the board, who's involved, what the model is, how to contact us. It's all there. We put everything out there in an incredibly transparent way.
All right. Well, with that, thank you, Dale. I really appreciate your time. This has been absolutely interesting and I think very insightful for my audience. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Have a great day.
You too.